In the 3rd century BCE, the Mediterranean was a chessboard of empires, ambitions, and ancient rivalries. At the heart of it stood two rising powers, Rome and Carthage. One was a land-hungry republic, expanding across the Italian peninsula. The other, a wealthy maritime empire with trading posts stretching from North Africa to Spain. They had coexisted, even signed treaties. But beneath the surface, tension brewed. And in 264 BCE, that tension erupted into the First Punic War, a brutal 23-year conflict that would reshape the ancient world. It all began in Sicily, the island that sat like a stepping stone between the two powers. Rich in grain, strategically located, and politically fragmented, Sicily was a magnet for conflict. The spark came from a group of rogue mercenaries, the Mamertines. Originally hired by Syracuse, they seized the city of Messana and declared independence. Threatened by Syracuse and Carthage, they appealed to Rome for help. Rome saw an opportunity to expand its influence. Carthage saw a threat to its dominance. Both sent forces. The result? A clash at Messana that marked the beginning of open war. According to Nigel Bagnall, in the Punic Wars, 264 to 146 BC, the Mamertine crisis was a local dispute that escalated into a full-scale war due to the strategic importance of Sicily and the ambitions of both powers. Rome's intervention was not just about aiding allies. It was about asserting dominance in a region that Carthage had long considered its own. At this point, Rome had no navy to speak of. Carthage, on the other hand, was a naval powerhouse. Their ships ruled the Western Mediterranean, and their sailors were seasoned veterans. But Rome was nothing if not adaptable. They captured a Carthaginian quinquereme, a massive warship, and used it as a blueprint. Within months, Roman shipyards churned out a fleet. But Rome didn't just copy Carthage. They innovated. They added the corvus, a boarding bridge that turned sea battles into land battles. Roman soldiers could now storm enemy decks like they were fighting on solid ground. This new tactic paid off at the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE. Roman commander Gaius Duilius led the fleet into combat, and the corvus proved devastating. Carthaginian ships were boarded and overwhelmed. Rome had won its first major naval victory. It was a turning point. The Republic had proven it could fight and win at sea. Charles River editors note that Rome's transformation into a naval power was one of the most remarkable adaptations in ancient military history. The corvus, while heavy and unwieldy, gave Rome the edge it needed to neutralize Carthage's superior seamanship. Over the next few years, Rome continued to build its navy and push Carthage back. In 256 BCE, they launched an ambitious invasion of North Africa. At Cape Ecnomus, one of the largest naval battles in history, Rome defeated the Carthaginian fleet and landed troops on African soil. The campaign began well. Roman forces won several battles, and Carthage sued for peace. But Rome's terms were harsh, too harsh. Negotiations collapsed. Carthage responded by hiring a Spartan mercenary named Xanthippus. He reorganized their army, trained their troops, and prepared for a counterattack. At the Battle of Bagradus, Xanthippus unleashed war elephants and superior tactics. The Roman army was crushed. Their commander, Marcus Atilius Regulus, was captured. Bagnall describes Regulus's campaign as a bold but ultimately reckless venture that underestimated Carthaginian resilience and overestimated Roman invincibility. The defeat was a sobering moment for Rome, reminding them that victory would not come easily. After the disaster in Africa, Rome shifted its focus back to Sicily. The war dragged on. Rome captured key cities like Panormus, while Carthage held on to strongholds like Lilybaeum and Drepana. Naval battles continued, but storms wreaked havoc on Roman fleets. Twice, entire armadas were lost to the sea. In 249 BCE, Rome suffered a major defeat at the Battle of Drepana. Their fleet was ambushed and dozens of ships were sunk. Morale plummeted. The Senate even considered abandoning naval warfare altogether. But Rome's resilience was unmatched. After years of stalemate, they raised funds from private citizens to build a new fleet, 220 ships fully equipped and crewed. In 241 BCE, this fleet launched a surprise attack on the Carthaginian navy at the Aegates Islands. The battle was swift and decisive. Carthage, exhausted and bankrupt, sued for peace. The terms were brutal. Carthage had to evacuate Sicily, surrender the Lipari Islands, and pay a massive indemnity, 3,200 talents of silver over 10 years. Rome had won. The First Punic War was over. The consequences were enormous. Rome emerged as the dominant naval power in the Western Mediterranean. Sicily became its first province, marking the beginning of Roman imperial expansion. Carthage, humiliated and financially crippled, turned inward. But the bitterness lingered. Among those who fought in the war was a Carthaginian general named Hannibal Barca. His son Hannibal would grow up vowing revenge against Rome, a vow that would ignite the Second Punic War. The First Punic War was more than a military conflict. It was a test of endurance, innovation, and willpower. Rome had transformed itself from a land-based republic into a maritime empire. Carthage had learned the limits of mercenary warfare and the dangers of underestimating a determined enemy. The war introduced new tactics, technologies, and political strategies that would echo through centuries of Roman history. It also revealed the brutal cost of ambition. Tens of thousands died, cities were razed, fleets were sunk, and yet neither side could afford to stop. The Mediterranean was too valuable, the stakes too high. In the end, Rome's ability to absorb losses, rebuild, and adapt gave it the edge. Carthage, despite its wealth and experience, couldn't match Rome's relentless drive. Bagnall concludes that the First Punic War was a war of attrition, fought not just with swords and ships, but with endurance and political will. It was a war that tested the very foundations of both empires. The legacy of the First Punic War lives on. It was the first chapter in a trilogy of conflicts that would decide the fate of the ancient world. It set the stage for Hannibal's legendary campaign, for Rome's conquest of the Western Mediterranean, and for the eventual destruction of Carthage itself. But in 264 BCE, none of that was certain. All that existed was a small island, a group of mercenaries, and two empires staring each other down. What followed was a war of attrition, of strategy, of sacrifice. And it all began in Sicily. Rome's victory in the First Punic War wasn't just a triumph of arms, it was a triumph of transformation. The Republic had reinvented itself, learned from its failures, and emerged stronger. Carthage, though defeated, had not yet fallen. The rivalry would continue. The blood feud was far from over. And so, as the dust settled over the Mediterranean, one truth became clear: the age of Rome had begun. The year is 218 BC. Rome and Carthage, two of the ancient world's greatest powers, are about to clash in one of the most brutal and decisive conflicts in history, the Second Punic War. For nearly 2 decades, from 218 to 201 BC, these two Mediterranean superpowers fought across 3 continents: Europe, Africa, and even parts of the Iberian Peninsula. At the heart of this war stood Hannibal Barca, one of the most brilliant generals of all time, whose daring strategies nearly brought Rome to its knees. On the other side, Rome answered with relentless resilience and eventually a new military genius, Scipio Africanus, the man who would turn the tide of history. This was not just a war of armies. It was a war of empires, cultures, and legacies. The outcome of the Second Punic War didn't just decide who controlled the Mediterranean, it shaped the course of Western civilization itself. To understand the Second Punic War, we must go back to the First Punic War, 264 to 241 BC. This earlier conflict, fought mostly at sea, ended with Rome's victory and Carthage losing control of Sicily, its most valuable colony. Crippled by war debt and humiliated, Carthage turned its attention to Spain, where a young and ambitious general, Hannibal Barca, built a new empire. Hamilcar's son, Hannibal Barca, was raised in this atmosphere of resentment. Ancient historian Polybius tells us that, as a boy, Hannibal swore a sacred oath to his father, eternal hatred of Rome. By the time Hannibal assumed command in Iberia around 221 BC, Carthage had rebuilt its strength. Rome, meanwhile, had grown more powerful. After defeating Carthage in the First Punic War, it expanded its influence in Italy and beyond. But Rome's aggressive diplomacy and constant expansion alarmed Carthage. The spark came at Saguntum, a city in Spain allied with Rome, but within Carthage's sphere of influence. Hannibal attacked and captured Saguntum in 219 BC, defying Rome. This was the final straw. In 218 BC, Rome declared war. The stage was set for one of the most extraordinary wars in history. At the center of this war were extraordinary leaders. First and foremost, Hannibal Barca. Known for his audacity, intelligence, and unorthodox tactics, Hannibal famously led an army, including war elephants, across the Alps into Italy, a feat that stunned the ancient world. His genius lay in anticipating Roman strategies and turning their discipline into a weakness. Opposing him was Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus. Initially too young to command, Scipio rose to prominence after witnessing Rome's darkest defeats. He learned from Hannibal, adopting flexibility and innovation, and ultimately became the man who would bring Carthage to its knees at Zama. Other figures also played critical roles. Fabius Maximus, nicknamed the Delayer, who pioneered guerrilla-style tactics against Hannibal. Hasdrubal Barca, Hannibal's brother, who tried to bring reinforcements from Spain but failed at the Battle of the Metaurus. Together, these individuals shaped the war's course. The Second Punic War is remembered for its dramatic battles, where Hannibal often outsmarted larger Roman armies. The Battle of Trebia, 218 BC. Hannibal lured the Romans into crossing the freezing Trebia River, exhausting them before battle. His hidden troops ambushed the Romans, crushing them. It was Hannibal's first great victory in Italy, proving Rome could be beaten on its own soil. The Battle of Lake Trasimene, 217 BC. Here, Hannibal set a perfect ambush along the shores of Lake Trasimene. Hidden in the hills, his forces attacked as the Roman army marched blindly through the fog. The result: nearly 30,000 Romans killed or captured, one of the largest ambushes in history. The Battle of Cannae, 216 BC. Perhaps Hannibal's masterpiece. Facing a much larger Roman army, around 80,000 men, Hannibal arranged his forces in a crescent formation. As the Romans pushed forward, the Carthaginian wings closed in, surrounding them completely. Polybius describes the slaughter. nearly 50,000 Romans killed in a single day. Cannae remains one of the greatest tactical victories in military history. Despite these losses, Rome refused to surrender. Under Fabius's delaying tactics, Rome avoided direct confrontation with Hannibal while striking Carthage's allies abroad. Scipio eventually took command in Spain, cutting Hannibal off from reinforcements, then invaded North Africa. The Battle of Zama, 202 BC. Hannibal and Scipio finally met at Zama in modern-day Tunisia. This time, Rome was ready. Scipio neutralized Carthage's war elephants and used flexible formations to counter Hannibal's tactics. With Numidian cavalry on his side, Scipio routed Hannibal. Hannibal, undefeated in Italy, suffered his first and final major defeat. Carthage was forced to sue for peace. What made the Second Punic War so fascinating was the clash of military styles. Hannibal's genius lay in deception and mobility. He excelled at ambushes, surprise maneuvers, and using terrain to his advantage. His ability to integrate diverse troops, Celtic warriors, Iberians, Numidian cavalry, and elephants, made his army unpredictable. Rome, on the other hand, relied on discipline and numbers. Early defeats taught them a harsh lesson. Rigid formations could be exploited. Under Fabius, Rome adopted a war of attrition, avoiding pitched battles with Hannibal. Later, under Scipio, Rome evolved, adopting Hannibal's flexibility. This war marked innovations in strategy, particularly the use of double envelopment at Cannae and combined arms coordination at Zama. It was a brutal classroom for Rome, but one that forged them into an unstoppable military power. The war ended with the Treaty of Zama, 201 BC. Carthage had to surrender its fleet, pay a crushing indemnity, and could no longer wage war without Rome's permission. Though Carthage survived as a city, it was reduced to a shadow of its former self. For Rome, victory meant dominance. With Carthage humbled, Rome became the unrivaled master of the Western Mediterranean. This set the stage for further expansion into Greece, Asia Minor, and beyond. But the consequences were also human. Entire generations of Romans were lost to battles like Cannae. Hannibal himself, after years of political exile, eventually took his own life to avoid capture by the Romans. Historian Livy wrote that no enemy had ever so terrified Rome as Hannibal did. Yet in defeating him, Rome proved its resilience and adaptability, traits that would allow it to build an empire lasting centuries. The Second Punic War was more than a clash of armies. It was a struggle of wills. Hannibal's brilliance nearly destroyed Rome, but Rome's endurance and Scipio's leadership turned the tide. From Trebia to Cannae to Zama, this conflict showcased some of the greatest military maneuvers in history. Its legacy is a reminder of how innovation, resilience, and leadership can change the fate of nations. In the end, Rome emerged as the supreme power of the ancient world, while Hannibal became a legend, admired even by those he fought. And that is the story of the war that defined an empire. In the decades after the Second Punic War, something surprising happened. Carthage bounced back, its economy revived, its farmland began producing in abundance again, and its trading networks flourished. By the mid-2nd century BC, Carthage looked prosperous once more. It wasn't an empire anymore, but as a city, it was still thriving. And to Rome, this was unacceptable. Rome had grown paranoid. Its politicians feared that Carthage, if left unchecked, might rise again and challenge them once more. No one embodied this paranoia more than Cato the Elder. Cato was an old Roman statesman, famous for his blunt, uncompromising views. He visited Carthage and saw its prosperity with his own eyes. And from then on, No matter what the topic in the Senate was, he ended every speech with the same phrase, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. The spark finally came in the 100s and 50s BC. Carthage was constantly harassed by its neighbor, Numidia, ruled by King Massinissa. Massinissa had been Rome's ally in the Second Punic War, and Rome let him expand freely at Carthage's expense. He raided Carthaginian lands, seized territory, and humiliated them. Carthage complained to Rome, but Rome did nothing. Eventually, Carthage had had enough. In 151 BC, it fought back against Numidia, and that was the opening Rome needed. By fighting without Rome's permission, Carthage had broken the treaty. Rome declared war. In 149 BC, a massive Roman army landed in North Africa. Carthage tried to avoid conflict at first. Its leaders sent envoys to negotiate. Rome demanded they surrender weapons. Carthage complied, handing over more than 200,000 sets of armor, 2,000 catapults, and countless swords and spears. But then Rome revealed the final demand. The people of Carthage were to abandon their city and move inland, at least 10 miles from the sea. For a city whose lifeblood was trade, whose very identity was tied to its harbor, this was suicide. The Carthaginians were outraged. Rome wasn't asking for peace. Rome was asking for death. And so Carthage made its choice. If it was going to die, it would die fighting. The siege of Carthage began. The city's defenses were formidable. Its walls stretched more than 30 feet high, strengthened with towers, and ringed around the city for miles. Inside, the population mobilized like never before. Temples and public buildings were stripped to provide materials for weapons. Women cut their hair to make ropes for catapults. Blacksmiths forged swords day and night. Even children carried stones to the battlements. This wasn't just an army defending the city. It was the entire population. The first Roman assaults failed. Carthaginian defenders hurled flaming projectiles from the walls, launched counterattacks, and fought with desperation. The siege turned into a grinding stalemate. For 2 years, Rome struggled to break Carthage. Disease and poor discipline plagued the Roman army. Carthage, though starving, held on. In 147 BC, the tide began to turn. Rome sent a new commander, Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus. Scipio was young, but ruthless and brilliant. He restored discipline to the Roman forces, tightened the blockade, and slowly choked the city into submission. Carthage was cut off from supplies. Hunger set in, starvation spread. And yet, the Carthaginians refused to surrender. By the spring of 146 BC, Scipio launched the final assault. The Romans broke through the walls and poured into the city. What followed was 6 days of hell. Carthage's streets were narrow and winding, perfect for ambushes. The defenders turned every house into a fortress. Romans had to fight room by room, tearing down walls to move forward. The screams of battle echoed through the city as fire spread from building to building. Families were slaughtered where they stood. Those who survived fought with the desperation of people who knew there was no tomorrow. The final resistance gathered in the Temple of Eshmun, dedicated to the god of healing. Thousands of soldiers and civilians barricaded themselves inside. As the Romans closed in, fires consumed the temple. Many Carthaginians chose to burn alive rather than be taken prisoner. When the smoke cleared, Carthage was gone. 50,000 survivors, men, women, and children, were marched away in chains, sold into slavery. The once great city was reduced to ruins. Its harbor was destroyed, its walls torn down, its buildings set aflame. Ancient writers later claimed that the Romans sowed the earth with salt so that nothing would ever grow there again. Whether that detail is true or just symbolic, the meaning was clear. Carthage was to be erased forever. The war had lasted just 3 years, but its consequences were immense. With Carthage destroyed, Rome no longer had a rival in the Western Mediterranean. Sicily, Spain, and North Africa were all firmly in Roman hands. The Mediterranean Sea, once called Mare Nostrum by the Romans, our sea, was now their playground. But more than territory, the Third Punic War revealed something new about Rome. In the earlier Punic Wars, Rome fought for survival. Hannibal had nearly crushed the Republic. Victory then was about staying alive. But by the Third Punic War, Carthage was no real threat. Rome didn't need to destroy it. Rome chose to.